Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 105, and this is the second part of our English constitutionalism discussion. And this one's going to run from about 1649 to 1689. Now, after the execution of the king, the English people experimented with a republic called the Commonwealth, ruled by Parliament, followed by a protectorate ruled by Oliver Cromwell, before inviting the return of the Stuart monarchy in 1660. Now, the restored Stuarts, Charles II and James II, sought to emulate Louis XIV by pursuing absolutism, but the power of Parliament over royal forces and the English people's rejection of Catholicism thwarted their plans. Now, finally, in 1688, the Protestant William of Orange invaded England and, with the support of the Protestant people, overthrew King James II. Now, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689 made England a Protestant constitutional monarchy and set the pattern for an alternative, more democratic form of government in Europe and the Americas. Now, the Commonwealth that ran from 1649 to 53, immediately upon the execution of the king, declared England a republic. Now, like the Frondeur aristocracy of France, the members of parliament, landowners, and merchants who engineered this revolution now wanted it to stop, with themselves at the top of the social hierarchy. But in killing the king, they had provided an opportunity for an example for ordinary people to break more links in the great chain of being. Now, many ordinary people, including the soldiers of the new model army, no longer wanted to be ruled by someone else. In particular, a group arose in the army called the Levelers, who wanted religious toleration, law reform, and universal manhood suffrage. In other words, they wanted to level the playing field, level society. Now, one participant in the new model army's debate over England's post-war constitution, Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, propounded the Leveler notion of contract and consent bubbling up from the people themselves, half a century before Locke. Now, other groups took advantage of the end of censorship to explore religious possibilities. The Baptists, or Dippers, believed that baptism and the choice of faith is implied and should be delayed until adulthood, when one could make a rational choice. The Seekers actually went from congregation to congregation seeking a permanent home. The Diggers, led by Gerard Winstanley, believed that Christ wanted property to be shared in common. The Ranters believed that nothing was a sin unless one conceived it to be a sin. The Quakers, led by George Fox, believed that all people contained God's inner light in equal measure, implying that a peasant was as good as a lord and a woman as good as a man. And the Muggletonians believed that Lodowick Muggleton, a tailor from the West Country, was the last prophet named in the Revelation. Now, most disturbing of all, though, to those who loved order were the Fifth Monarchy men. They believed that the Bible had foretold 5 great monarchies on earth. 4 had already fallen: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Given that the 5th was to be the kingdom of King Jesus, the Commonwealth was only an interim arrangement to be brought into conformity with Mosaic law. Now, religious toleration and a free press had produced religious and political diversity, or to contemporize, chaos. The ruling elite was horrified by the sects and began to think better of the experiment with religious toleration and freedom of speech. This would doom rule by the Commonwealth and eventually the Revolution. In the end, the Parliament that ruled the Commonwealth was too radical for conservative country gentlemen and too conservative for levelers and sectarians. In 1653, the army, upset at being sent to Ireland to pacify Catholics, which they did with enthusiasm, without being paid, sent Parliament home. And after a number of experiments, the army named its current commander Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, Cromwell briefly pursued Louis's policies, even before Louis himself did so. He assumed many of the trappings of godlike kingship without being a king. He was a strong, decisive leader and tireless worker. He divided England into 11 military districts, each ruled by a major general, not unlike the French Intendant. The generals were supposed to maintain law and order, keep an eye on Anglicans and Royalists, and suppress rebellion, riot, blasphemy, swearing, drunkenness, gambling, fornication, adultery, indecent fashions, alehouses, playhouses, Sunday sports, and Christmas celebrations. The generals, of course, were terribly unpopular. Parliament's complaints about money also gave Cromwell fits. Cromwell was also an independent Puritan, granted religious toleration for all Protestant sects, and readmitted the Jews into England, which he saw as part of the Second Coming. He pursued an aggressive Protestant foreign policy. He crushed rebellions in Ireland and Scotland, in the former case ruthlessly. He won a trade war with the Dutch, and he captured Jamaica from the Spanish. He was also the first solvent ruler of England since Henry VII, but at tremendous cost. The Protectorate's excise tax on beer and other commodities hurt the poor. He confiscated the lands of Royalists, Anglicans, and Catholics, and this activity yielded an annual revenue of £2 million, far more than Charles I had to play with, but at the cost of much grumbling and resentment. Now, Oliver Cromwell died in 1658. Now, as in France, after more than a year of instability, the English ruling elite decided to restore the Stuart monarchy in the person of Charles I's son, Charles II, to the throne of his father. Now, in many ways, Charles II, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, and his brother James II, who ruled from 1685 to 1688, were reruns of their father and grandfather. Now, neither Charles I nor James II was godlike. Charles II was witty, affable, and a great conversationalist, and he could also be quite undignified. Having been made cynical by his father's fate, he gave himself over to pleasure in the company of his mistresses, who included the beautiful, ambitious Countess of Castlemaine, who converted to Catholicism, the Duchess of Portsmouth, named Louis-Renée de Keroualle, French and Catholic, and pretty, witty Nell Gwynn, who was Protestant. James II, who succeeded Charles II in 1685, was more dignified, a military man, who had shown courage under fire. He was also less witty and more of a plotter, and worse in the eyes of his subjects, James II was a Roman Catholic. Now, neither Charles nor James was in control, unlike their cousin Louis XIV. Though Charles was lazy, James was a hard worker like Louis XIV. Unlike Louis, they did not have an efficient local bureaucracy at their disposal. And above all, though restored to the throne of their father, the brothers still had to deal with a powerful and sometimes uncooperative parliament. Now, neither Charles nor James was wealthy, at least at first. At the Restoration, Charles II was voted revenue that was supposed to yield £1.2 million a year. But the taxes voted with it did not always yield that amount. Worse, like his father and grandfather, Charles loved to spend money on art, architecture, his mistresses, and their numerous offspring. Parliament was also unwilling to finance these hobbies. And in 1685, James was luckier. Because a group of Whigs revolted soon after his accession, Parliament voted him more than £2 million in revenue. Now, neither Charles nor James could enforce conformity, and in part because they did not entirely conform to the Church of England themselves. Both Charles and James were attracted to Catholicism and religious toleration, but Charles was too smart and knew his people too well to do much about it. James was not smart. As Duke of York, he openly worshipped as a Catholic in the 1670s. As king, he tried to convince Parliament to legalize Catholicism. This action, of course, was unpopular, but people put up with it because they assumed that when James died, he would be succeeded by his Protestant daughter Mary, married to William of Orange, the Protestant champion. But in 1688, James's second wife, Mary Beatrice of Modena, gave birth to a son, who would clearly be raised Catholic, supersede the female Mary, and continue his father's policies. Now at this point, William of Orange decided to invade England, landing in the south on the 5th of November, 1688. James II fled to France on the 11th of December, 1688, and after much debate, Parliament on the 13th of February, 1689, asked William and Mary to take the crown as William III and Mary II. Now, these actions began to solve most of the problems plaguing English monarchies since the reign of Henry VIII in a very different way from Louis XIV's solution. And we typically call this time period the Glorious Revolution. The problem of sovereignty was cleared up, and the king was not a god because Parliament had chosen him. And in effect, Parliament was sovereign. In terms of control, the English king remained powerful, but his financial and diplomatic situation would dictate that he could no longer rule without Parliament. In terms of finance, the revolution would lead to a series of wars with France that would force the crown and Parliament to finally solve the crown's money problems by tapping into the growing wealth of the English economy. With religion in mind, clearly England would not be Catholic. England would remain Anglican officially, and Parliament would grant toleration to Puritans, because they had supported the revolution. The problem of sovereignty was also cleared up. William's accession would bring the British kingdoms into his fight against France, and in fact the ensuing 9 Years' War would be the first of 7 colossal conflicts pitting Britain against France between 1688 and 1850. Finally, the Glorious Revolution marks England's and thus Europe's first completely successful break from the great chain of being.